And good afternoon to everyone. I am Dr. Small. I serve as the program director for our online EA bachelor's program. We also have.
Hi, everyone. Dr. Cameron Beatty, Kids, assistant professor in the higher ed program and our undergraduate leadership studies program.
Hello, everyone. Ayesha, Khurshid, faculty in international multicultural.
All right, so we wanted to get us started with just some objectives in terms of our goals for today. For those of you who did not join us in the fall, I know we've had a lot to take place between last September until now, particularly with all of the faculty hires and just things that take place during the semester. And so this is not intended to be a massive reporting back, but definitely wanted to share some updates in terms of where we are. We do recognize that this is not a destination, but a journey that we're hoping to kind of continue to engage in. And so in terms of objectives for today, we definitely wanted to start by recapping critical race theory and critical theory in terms of our framework for addressing some of the work around social justice, provide also some recent legislative updates and discuss related implications for K through 12, as well as some case study information that we've collected related to other colleges of education who have been responding to things like critical theory and social justice. Also sharing the recent survey results from our faculty and student population that took place during the month of February, and then roll into some thinking and reflection in terms of our current status as a department, as a program, and then what are some of those next steps for us moving forward in terms of looking at action steps that we can actively take as a department. So I can hide that. And then finally talking about the focus group proposal that we discussed in the fall in terms of moving forward with some of the work related to critical race theory and social justice. We'll get started with some of the provisional definitions, and so I'll turn it over to Dr. Beatty to cover some of those recap items that we discussed in the fall.
So I won't spend a lot of time, but I do want us to have common language about what we're talking about, because we did spend a good part of our first half of the R3 in the fall really digging into, well, what are we talking about with critical race theory. I like to start with this definition of culture versus race, because the issue with this is language gets convoluted and confused, used interchangeably and misused. So what are we actually talking about when we talk about culture versus race, right? And culture really means, how do we think about our shared social engagement from one generation to another, and thinking about regional location, other things play into how we understand and make meaning of culture, right? And when we speak specifically about race, what we're talking about is how people have been historically categorized, oftentimes by skin color or perceived physical traits, right? And then this concept of multiculturalism is a recognition that we all bring different aspects of ourselves and have cultural difference. And we bring that together. How do we celebrate that? What does that mean to be in community with one another? And then thinking about anti-racism is really thinking about what's the action related to dismantling issues of prejudice, discrimination centered around specifically race, right? With critical race theory, we are specifically looking at the concept and a field of inquiry that was started by legal scholars, and we highlighted that in our last R3. And how do you think about race, racism, and anti-Blackness across history, across society, and how systems and structures have been maintained to disenfranchise some and benefit others? With critical race theory, when thinking about systemic racism, it's really about how do we interrogate those everyday systems, whether that be the law, whether that be legal, whether that be education, which all of us sit in, and really think critically about the historical implications of discrimination and racism, and then how that shows up in present day. This R3 got jumped off in the fall because of the attack, quote unquote, on critical race theory, right? So the argument is that when we talk about race or issues of social justice, it's been convoluted that all of those things is critical race theory. And the reason why we want to distinguish is that is not the case, right? But this argument has been rooted in talking about race, talking about difference across race, makes young learners feel uncomfortable. So then that is critical race theory, and critical race theory is therefore problematic. So we need to have legislation that addresses the problematic quote unquote nature of critical race theory. So we want to make sure that we're clear about like what we're talking about. It is a theoretical, it is a lens, it is an application of understanding historical experiences rooted in law, rooted in systems, rooted in structures that disenfranchise other people based on race.
The other construct that we wanted to also pull into the fold here, I hate this bar, is the idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And so those terms we hear in many different formats, but oftentimes we also see that many of those concepts are convoluted into one. And if you're doing one, you can encapsulate everything else. And so wanted to also take some time to speak a little bit about some of the difference in terms of what it means by diversity. And so through the lens of diversity, thinking about the people and perspectives, and the idea that perspectives and having the people at the table in terms of having that diversity in opinion, diversity in outlook, and what that means for us as educators, as well as in our educational practice. So who's sitting at the table? Who's making up our classrooms? Who's making up our executive boards? The idea of equity in terms of policy and practice and position. And so this ties into the current policies and practices that make it equitable in terms of opportunities. And so are the individuals that are sitting at the table having the equity in terms of opportunity based upon our practices, policies, and procedures. In terms of inclusion, and so although you may be at the table, do you have a voice? And so are you included in the decision making? And so I may have, in terms of a staff of my school, I may have a 25% population that makes up certain subgroups, but does that also reflect in terms of my leadership team? Or is everyone on my leadership team the same homogeneous population and background? And so thinking about how do we include the different voices and what power do we give them once they're in those places? And then the idea of justice in terms of just crossing systems. And so not just social justice, but justice in terms of healthcare, justice in terms of finances, justice in terms of the law. And so also thinking through the lens of, are we providing equal rights and equal opportunities for individuals within those different pockets? I think this also speaks to us redefining the vision. I think the pandemic has also allowed us to reimagine what this looks like. And so it's almost giving us a reset opportunity to where people are now thinking about these things. We're re-envisioning and thinking about the roles that we can play in these different pockets and what that means for us as educational leaders in our respective areas. Another thing that we wanted to kind of bring to the forefront is just some updates in terms of kind of lending itself to the legislative updates, the current situation. And so there are currently 36 states that are working or have efforts in place in terms of restricting education based upon racism, bias, and contribution to specific racial or ethnic groups in the US history or related topics. Parallel to that, we have approximately 17 states that are expanding education on racism, bias, contributions, specific racial or ethnic groups. And so we have this movement that's currently taking place as well in terms of looking at states across the board that are not only working to restrict certain voices, but we also have some proactive states that are also looking to expand some of those voices in terms of legislation. And so this was pulled from Talkbeat, which is a nonprofit journalism group that it's working to kind of track where these pieces of legislation are housed and then how states are responding to some of the issues related to social justice as well as critical theory. In terms of legislation updates, Dr. Khurshid.
Thank you. So we did discuss some of the pieces of legislation or bills in the fall. So there have been some new ones, but before moving on to these individual pieces that are bills or legislation, I think it's important to also frame the way we have been approaching it. So critical race theory does focus on quite extensively on these pieces of legislation and laws, but more than that, it also steps back and looks at the narratives that are deriving these pieces of legislation, bill, or other legal frameworks. So here, because some of them might not seem directly relevant to the institutions of education. So the way we are approaching it is that education is not merely what is happening in the classrooms, but it is happening in a lot of places, in a lot of spaces. And what is happening outside of this is really shaping what's happening inside the classrooms. So of course, it's very important to look at those bills and legislation, but also what is happening in terms of all these shifts happening at this point in time. Because there's so many changes that are happening in that area that it's hard to even follow them. And there's this, I think, exhaustion that many people are feeling. And because of that, and this is something that we talked about, that because of that, at times you're not able to respond as an institution, as a group of people, or as practitioners, educational scholars, because there is so much that is happening. So once, because of that exhaustion, we kind of zone out. These things kind of pick up because we are not able to respond. So we are trying to look at these issues in terms of how can we respond as an institution proactively? So we are not merely reacting to these individual pieces, but how do we think about it and then think of some potential responses? So I think some of the laws that we talked about in the fall were related to critical race theory, the banning of it, but there are a number of new laws that or bills that have been proposed and adopted. So maybe we can just, for the sake of time, go to the parental rights in education. So there were 3 laws that were bills that were passed earlier, and some of them had become legislation. Yes. So so this bill that is titled as Parental Rights in Education, or as many people are calling it, Don't Say Gay Bill. Based on the language of the policy, and again, I think in terms of just understanding what's going on, if you just pay attention to the language of the bill itself, where it talks about reinforcing the fundamental rights of parents to make decisions regarding upbringing and control of their children. So that's the kind of language that I think very few people would disagree with, the rights of parents. But then it goes on and it talks about how it prohibits classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in certain grade levels, requires school districts to notify parents of healthcare services, authorizes parents to bring action against school district to obtain declaratory judgment, provides for additional award of injustice relief damages and reasonable attorney fee and court costs to certain parents. So this is really inviting all these cases against these schools. So again, the issue is not that how this law will be implemented, but what this law does in terms of shaping how people are thinking about it, and especially what school leaders and teachers decide to teach in their classrooms. Because if you're not sure what is acceptable or not, and you don't want to get sued, you would just not even talk about issues that might not be covered by this law.
I was going to say, this also connects into even the material that schools are allowed to have on campus and some of the questions that come about. So if I have a textbook in my school library that may talk about someone that may be part of one of these protected groups, then now there's requests for those to be removed because of how the legislation has been framed. It creates a snowball effect in terms of not just classroom instruction, but instructional materials. Or, you know, if I'm depicting a character in a text and they seem overly masculine or female, does that open up for these informal conversations and thereby putting teachers, instructors in these odd situations, or having a child go home and say, hey, Ms. Jones had this in my classroom, and now the school district is being sued because they had this concept. And so I think it also just snowballs into so many other factors. And mainly, I mean, thinking about not just the instructional piece, but also the materials that they're allowed to use, or teachers are allowed to use in their classroom settings.
There was a separate bill targeting the material, the curriculum material, and that bill died, but probably it will come back. So just to see that a number of bills died, but just they are all along the same lines of restricting what schools or teachers can do. So just some analysis that has been done that the bill states that lessons about sexual orientation are banned outright in kindergarten through third grade, while prohibiting lessons in other grades unless they are age appropriate and developmentally appropriate. The measure which would give parents the right to sue school districts awaits Governor Ron DeSantis' signature. It is scheduled.
He signed that.
He did sign it? Oh, yes, right, he signed it yesterday, right? That's what.
Monday.
Yeah. So it was supposed to be signed in July. So this bill claims to strengthen parental rights by preventing teachers and school staffers from withholding information about gender issues from parents. So when we made the slides, I think we didn't know that he was going to sign it, but I think he signed it yesterday. So another bill that
And I think the lawsuit for this is still pending that was centered here in Leon County. It was a student here in Leon County schools that was at least has become one of the prominent figures in terms of the lawsuit that stemmed from this as well.
So another bill that is called Postsecondary Education that has been adopted. It authorizes the Board of Governors to adopt a regulation regarding post-tenure reviews for state university faculty. Interestingly, this tenure-related amendment was added at the last moment, apparently. It was supposed to be about other issues under post-secondary education. And so it does include some of those dimensions such as statewide course numbering system and identifying and determining accrediting agencies. And also how now higher education institutions are required to post information related to tuition and fee rates and proposed changes. So these were some of the kind of review or points that have been provided by the faculty union. And the main idea there is that this post-tenure review is actually a backdoor to controlling the kind of content that is being taught in college campuses in post-secondary education, because this review now I think I believe it's part of the review that the same accrediting agency cannot conduct the review twice in a row. So they have to go to different agencies. And one thing that came up in those reviews was that of these universities of FSU and I think University of Florida, the last review that was done by these agencies was that the Board of Governors have too much control over what's happening in the university. So one perspective is that this legislation is actually a response to that now there's going to be even more control of that. So if tenure is threatened and if faculty feel that there are certain topics that are not acceptable, then over time, how would that shape the kind of teaching and learning that happens in classrooms? And without that job security and that healthy and protected tenure culture. And again, I think looking at this legislation that has been adopted about reducing fetal and infant mortality, this is regarding abortion. And again, this is, I think in terms of understanding the larger debates here and the larger structures and the way there is this push to make certain changes, this is part of that, and this came along with all the other laws. So this is changing the what is allowed and what is not allowed. So it is redefining the meaning of abortion and the legal period under which it can be conducted, and then there's a new edition that it is completely banned after a specific time, and also the legal requirement of receiving signatures from certain medical personnel in order to be allowed to have that option.
So we wanted to offer, when we were talking about this, you're like, well, Well, how are other institutions, how are other colleges of education responding to this, right? And how do we think about our peer institutions or institutions that we can learn from about what our response to some of these legislative matters are? So the American Association for University Professors did release a statement and talked about the attempts of banning critical race theory and restricting race and racism and the implications for learning that has. There have been a number of faculty senates that have responded to resolutions through legislation by offering resolutions. As we know, sometimes resolutions don't do a lot, but they offer a community of understanding about what is our institution's response, what is our collective response, whether that be from the faculty or from the institution. There are two universities that kind of have publicly said what they're going to do, and we are in line with them. So if you go to the next slide, specifically Ohio State and Penn State have said that we're going to offer professional development around the legislative cycle, the legislative process, so we know what we're fighting against. The other one is thinking about building capacity for understanding what's our rights to lobby. So the faculty union has done that similar to Ohio State and Penn State of thinking about what we need to lobby legislation around these particular legislators around these particular issues. The other point that I wanted to make really quickly before we look at our own data is thinking about Florida. In some ways, Florida, we are a leader here in the sense of these legislators are just copying and pasting the bill. So some of the professional development is what's happening in other states and then what's coming down the pipe here. In some ways, we don't have that liberty because we are jumpstarting a lot of these bills that other states are now copying and pasting to think about. So for us is thinking about who's our liaisons to the legislature, what information do they have as far as bills that will be introduced in the cycle, and how do we have a better understanding of what's happening before things happen, before things move to a committee, and then to the floor to vote, and then to the governor's desk. So I think we have some ideas. We want to share some data with you, but we'll do that here in a second. We're going to pause and think about some clarification questions. What are you sitting with? We sped through that because we have some more information to share. So we want to offer some space to offer any clarification.
How are you guys maintaining composure during this challenging time?
I have a question regarding the.
I think Dr. Khurshid and Dr. Small said that, like, in some ways we can't keep up, or you think that, like, okay, this is the last one, and then something like slides through. So that's the part that that is frustrating in the sense of even when you want to stay informed, that it's moving extremely quickly, that it's difficult to stay informed, even with the best intention. So that's, for me, it's been a little frustrating, but being able to process with colleagues and make meaning, because some of the bills I read, I'm like, what the hell is this? So helping to make meaning of what is happening. The other thing is actually reading the bill for myself has been helpful, at least for me, to process, because an outlet will report out what's happening, but it's difficult to get through the clouds and actually read, well, what is the bill actually saying? And then what is the analysis in the sense of intentions of the bill? Because some of the things you read, like, oh, okay, I agree with that. And then you go to the next line, it's like, okay, what's the intention behind that statement that I might agree with, but there's some misalignment is around intention and then what the outcome is. But to answer your question is being able to process with colleagues is how I'm saying right now.
Thank you.
We have a question from online. So about the United Faculty Bill, is it basically a long-term attack on academic freedom?
I would say yes, absolutely. I think in academia, there has been that freedom to teach different content and to be able to engage with different perspectives. And I think tenure is, one of the pillars that supported that. And I think taking that away is not merely about tenure. It is about what is being taught in college campuses. And this whole, they came at it in the name of diversity that, that the campuses are liberal and students are being indoctrinated, and that's the wording of the bill. And now they're coming at it from the other perspective. So if you think that you can be video recorded anytime and you don't have job security, that creates a certain environment in which you don't feel very confident about speaking about different issues or talking about issues that are sensitive for many reasons. So I think I agree with that.
Definitely working to, I think, shape the narrative. And there are definitely a lot of hands in the fire in terms of what our State Department of Education can manipulate in terms of K through 12, but then you get into academia, there is more freedom. And so then how can I, if that is where my educators are coming from, that is where our school leaders are coming from, then how do I also massage that piece to try to pull certain pieces from that narrative to where, I think in terms of the stance in terms of critical race theory and what we're talking about today stem from legal policies that were coming up. And so you had a group of researchers who were looking at how are these policies and these legal battles connected to what we're seeing in our school systems. And so if I create a policy or a law that says thou shalt not do this, then students in my classroom don't have that exposure. And so you have this perception or this mainly Eurocentric curriculum that's being placed in terms of students and what they see, and they don't see the other side. And so if there's not that representation or those equal voices, then we shape the narrative of what we have in the future. And then those individuals become the next round of leaders. And so we constantly see kind of this toggle of how do I keep the policies where I need them to be for this infrastructure that's in place to remain where it is.
The other thing with the academic freedom is in this particular bill is when people have misunderstandings and misperceptions of what tenure is, then you can shape the narrative around that understanding, right? So if you think that faculty don't get any post-tenure review, and you're like, oh, somebody should not have a job forever and never have to have any accountability, whereas we as faculty get reviewed annually, right? Like there's a misunderstanding of what that means, and then they latch on to a misunderstanding in order to drive a narrative. I think the Dr. Yin called like this backdoor of what they're really trying to do when they can grab on to a misunderstanding or misperception. Then there's a backdoor to get at academic freedom.
Can I just jump in? I think, Cameron, I was trying to sort out some thoughts in my head because there's a lot, right? And I think that that's ultimately the key of what our opportunity is here.
Mm-hmm.
And that should open up our eyes in terms of the jobs that we need to do, is to clarify those awful misunderstandings. And because we paint it, and it is, on the face of it, on paper, it's awful. It's just, it's terrible, it's threats. It changes kind of where we thought we were heading into a different kind of world, and ideally in a better world, however long that might be taking. But I think there's still opportunities here, and I can't do it for everything, but let me just give you a perspective on accreditation. At the last faculty senate meeting, the president spoke about this part of the, kind of accreditation and changing the accrediting institutions. And from his perspective, coming from like the Northeast, where accreditors, and also from Harvard, but for the accreditation, the accrediting agencies don't have much authority. They come in, they check, it's an audit. Here, SACS has shaped what the institution is doing, and perhaps arguably in really great ways, but in also ways it's a really heavy-handed thing. And so there's all these different kind of perspectives sometimes that if we can build it and we can look at opportunities to educate people, opportunities to take advantage of things. I mean, I'm waiting until, I forgot which bill it was, but I'm waiting until when students of color are upset and families of color are upset and they sue. Because right now we're thinking it's all gonna be the white kids in the classroom. So it's just how the opportunities that are there to really shape the world still. And it's a barrier, but it takes another level of effort,
In case anyone was interested with the accrediting board piece, FSU is due for accreditation review in 2024. Last Wednesday, the Board of Governors approved us to stay with SACS. So we will have SACS again for next, we just found that out last week. Otherwise, we're gonna start over again. And it sunsets in 2032, which is an interesting piece. And I have not heard anyone articulate why, but it ends in 2032.
So FSU got in front of this new legislation trying to
It passed, and we appealed to the Board of Governors, and the Board of Governors granted us an exception because we're so close. And the argument is that we've been preparing already for a SACS review, so we'll go through SACS the next time around.
But in 5 years, we can't use that.
If this holds, that's true, for our next accreditation cycle. But then it sunsets in 2032, and I've never had a good explanation about why.
What sunset in,
That bill, so that law that we have to switch accrediting agencies, it's written into it that it ends in 2032.
and I think some of the opponents of the bill, some legislators who said that we will be coming back to it in 3 years because we're going to lose faculty, we will have really hard time attracting faculty, and we will lose federal money. So I think that's what Democrats said. I don't know how to do with that.
I think, yeah, and this one comment about tenure. And I'm not a scholar on tenure, but my understanding is it's quite often phrased as we're protecting faculty. I think it's the real value is protecting society. And I think it's in the way that the leadership of society comes out of high school institutions. You want their minds to be open, them to be able to critically assess information. And I think that's the real value, not the faculty that benefit. The faculty may also benefit. That's not the truth.
We have a follow-up question. So according to the graph of states, there are also some states that are restricting education while simultaneously expanding its access. Could you please elaborate more on what this dual agenda looks like? So there were, to paraphrase, there were states that are trying to restrict the education and also expand it. So I think Colorado and New York were two that I saw. This was a question, like Colorado and New York are doing both at the same time. So can you maybe talk what that actually looks like?
And I didn't delve into what those bills look like. I'm assuming there may be some legislation being passed on both sides potentially that hasn't been finalized. And so I'm assuming they may have captured those pieces of legislation. Maybe there's some senators or House
Yeah, I
speakers.
don't know the exact state, but I'll do a hypothetical. For example, a state might say, oh, we really like this language in the Don't Say Gay bill where parents should have the right to decide what happens in the classroom. But I want my students to have diversity, equity, and inclusion training, right? That's the type of thing that is happening in some of these legislative bodies, in the sense of we're not as bad as that state. Oh, I like the language of this legislation. So there's some things happening that says I'm about social justice, but if I can lobby to have parents' rights, and what does parents' rights look like? That's the kind of dichotomy. What's the word? I can't find my words today. Yeah, that's the paradox that's happening with some of these legislative bodies.
One last question, and that's, one thing that I don't think we've talked about is additionally the recognizing citizens.
I've never had a
Something that's very similar to the Texas law for having citizens regulate abortion clinics. Is that something that is, yeah, I mean, you were not in Soma City, it's on your minds, and I don't know if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share on that. If not, I will just.
Well, I think it's a strategy, right? It's a strategy of so our legislators, I love some of them dearly, but some of they're not writing these bills, right? A body, a nonprofit is writing and giving legislation. There's lawyers that have been put together across the country that's writing a lot of this language. And that is one of the strategies, is to say, we're not saying the law, like someone's gonna come into your classroom, it's gonna be a police officer, and they're gonna say you did this. But how it gets flagged is a parent says that the teacher did this, or a citizen says, right? And that is a strategy to make people feel empowered, right? And that's a strategy to make people buy into a bill that they might not fully understand. But if I get to decide for my child, I should have that right to decide for my child, right? That is a strategy within the legislative process that is being enacted in a lot of the language and the execution of a lot of this legislation.
It's been very effective in places like Nazi Germany, and then also in the fictional world of 1984.
Yeah, and I think it's this, it's so interesting, right? That what kind of language resonates where, right? So people, when we are used to certain kind of narratives, as you know, we have certain attachments to them and we respond to them. So the idea of individual rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all, and then using that language and then putting certain things under it. And I think that's where the language of these bills is so interesting, where they are just collapsing these things and somehow they make sense. And people just kind of pick different things. So, and I think that's why it's very important to kind of step back and look at the ideological framing of these bills. What is really happening here? Nobody is going to say, oh, you know, as Dr. Beatty is saying, oh, no, parents should not have rights. Like, nobody is going to say that, but what does that mean in terms of living in a democratic society? And again, you know, having this freedom of expression and freedom of speech.
Yeah, to follow up on that, it's more of a comment when we talk about a parent's rights. And I was just curious is who are those parents are lobbying for those bills? And when we talk about parents should have the right to decide what is taught to their children, who are those parents, and you know, what groups of parents are actually aware of what's going on in the classroom, or what they're supposed to participate or sue or reject, or it's just really interesting. If some of the topics are left for the parents to teach, what parents teach those topics, what don't, and then what have the kids missed out if their parents are not able to do so.
And definitely whose voice gets to get heard. I mean, if I have the financial willingness to and resources to collectively promote and or take a stance or write letters to senators or whatever it is that's being done versus those who may not have those resources, but who gets the short end of the stick in it. And so I'm pulling out this resource. I'm saying you cannot do this, but there's another body of students that may glean from that information. So we also get to see a little bit of that transaction of that in terms of who has the power and the resources to make their voices heard.
Or they're just passing out misinformation. So then that child gets misinformation and then grows up to be a parent and gives misinformation, right? So another part three though.
All right, so let's transition to the survey data. And so this was, I think, one of the big staple pieces in terms of some of the information that we've been able to collect. I will say that our sample size was not very large, and so we'll talk about that as well. But kind of our game plan that we rolled out in the fall was to not only pilot the survey, but also engage in some work in terms of focus groups and looking at how we can engage some small group discussions and provide some feedback and some context to what's taking place specifically within our department. And so in terms of our response rates, we have roughly 300 or so students, and so only 49 students completed the survey, which is about 16%. And then faculty responses, out of the 21, there were 10, which is a 48%. And so not a huge sample size. And so just keeping that in context in terms of the information that we're extracting, some of the discussion we've had in terms of who actually made up those numbers. And so kind of based upon the data, we can assume that a lot of the individuals who may have responded have some interest in the topic to some extent. And so there may be some sampling in terms of individuals who just may not have had the time, but also knowing that when you're tackling these types of courageous conversations, you may not get some of those responses. And so that's something that we've been talking about in terms of how do we move forward with collecting additional feedback to ensure that we have the whole picture.
If I can just make a really quick point.
Yes.
The other issue that might be with the response rate is fatigue, right? February was a rough month for a lot of us, so it's fatigue of life, but some of us might have fatigue around the issues. And I would ask us not to sit in the fatigue, because that's how legislation gets passed so quickly in our wonderful state of Florida, is because we're tired of some of the wild, for some of us, it's just really out there legislation, but it's moving so quickly that we can't keep up, and we're trying to keep up with our lives and we get fatigued. We might be fatigued, we didn't get a chance to click on the survey, but I would ask us not to sit in a fatigue or a space of, I can't deal with this right now, in the sense of, they're already planning spring 23, right? There's already legislation that's gonna be planned for the next legislative cycle. And we can't get fatigue. I know it's a survey, it's a departmental survey, but I think it's a representation for some of us of the fatigue that we might be feeling around having to address and deal with these issues.
If I might add to that, and I think as a department, as an educational policy department, that's why we need to step back a little and think proactively, right? Not just respond to piece by piece, but kind of see that how do we want to engage with these issues and respond? Because then we will have fatigue if we just kind of take it one by one.
I think that lends to what Dr. Harrington said about us building. I mean, we're producing the next scholars and leaders. And so that pipeline in terms of what are we producing and using in our classrooms to get there. So the first question that we had on there in terms of how would you rate your understanding of critical race theory? And so this was kind of that starting piece, and you'll see some similarities here. Overall, there was about 90% combined between above average and somewhat above average for faculty in terms of rating their understanding of critical race theory. And similar, but not to the same extreme for students at about 78% combined of somewhat above average and average that's sort of read in our grade spaces here. We begin to see that there are some far below and somewhat below average pieces here in terms of students. And so we, in terms of the sample size, students that were reporting that, hey, I don't have it all. I'm not clear on the understanding, but definitely in terms of those who understood, but thinking about the sample size, you know, what % of students actually responded and what does this actually represent in terms of overall big picture. Thinking about critical theory, and so this goes beyond just critical race theory, but thinking about those critical theories that are out there that we kind of covered in the fall, as well as ones that are continuing to evolve, and where you felt in terms of comfort level. So faculty here, again, had another high percent in terms of understanding at about a 90% combined between the somewhat above and above average ratings. Student kind of very similar in terms of a combined total of 64. We're around the average, and then we start to again see more of those below average cells kind of popping in terms of being versed in various other critical theories that are out there. Would you like to learn more about critical theory or other social justice theories? And so 100% from faculty, and then kind of counter to that in terms of student responses. Overall, 83% rated as yes, would like to learn more about critical theory and or social justice topics, and then we get a few percentage that were in the maybe and or no. And so I'm not interested in the social justice or critical theory kind of framework. And so we see a little bit of that in terms of the student representation, which is telling as well. Format in terms of how information should be shared was kind of the next piece that we kind of toggled into. And so looking at kind of gaining some information in terms of what we want to learn about and now how do we learn. There was definitely a lot of similarity here in terms of 80% of both groups ranging in terms of wanting some large group and small group reporting formats for gaining information. And then we also see a 21% reporting back from students in terms of course offerings, which is juxtaposed to faculty that was about 10%. Of course, we're not sitting in a Canvas course as well, but students definitely chimed in terms of wanting to see some of that information shared within our courses and not just within an R3 or a seminar format. Do you plan to use critical race or social justice theories in your research? In terms of faculty, 90% that responded were in a yes, and we had a maybe for 10%, which is one person. And then for students, we were toggling between the maybe and the yes, with 55% reporting that yes, they may be using or plan to use critical race theory or social justice theories in research or practice, and then a 33% maybe, and then 12% as being no from students. Do you currently teach courses that include, and then we also asked students about have they taken a course that included any critical or social justice theories. In terms of faculty, 70% reported that yes, they do and or have, with 30% reporting no. In terms of students, 81% that responded reported that yes, they had taken a course that had some of these constructs, and then a 19% reported that they had not had a course that encompassed critical or social justice theories. Effectiveness, I think kind of in this landscape, we did not ask about the types of assignments. And so kind of that broad picture of how effective were the assignments or discussions you experienced related to critical or social justice theories. So faculty perspective, extremely effective and very effective, or kind of in that a third for the most part. And so as faculty, sometimes we don't have all of those nuts and bolts in terms of feedback from assignment or week to week. You know, we gauge it based upon what we may get in terms of discussion boards, in terms of paper, in terms of was that an effective week? Did they really gain what I wanted them to gain in terms of objectives? In terms of students, very effective and extremely effective, made up over half. And so 46% very effective, extremely 19. And then we get into the moderately effective at 28. And then we have some slightly and non-effective. And so I think that other lens of this is thinking we did not delve into the types of assignment. Was it a paper? Was it a discussion? And so that would be something else to kind of glean from in terms of what are the types of assignments that those professors are using. And are they face-to-face, are they virtual, and have they been effective, and what's kind of been the feedback in terms of how you collected data on the effectiveness of those types of discussions or assignments. Would you be interested in participating in focus groups with something else that we collected that we'll kind of also delve in at the close of today in terms of moving forward, and about a 50-50 split on some of these. And so faculty, 57% were interested in focus group with 43 as no. For students, 60% yes, with the 40% of no, they would not be interested in serving in focus groups. So some of the things, and we'll kind of collaborate in terms of the task force on some of these. And so some of the things that emerged in response to ensuring students can learn about these approaches. We kind of talked a little bit about some of these approaches, but the top two that are bolded were by far the most reported in terms of types of ways that we can approach these. And so integrating into multiple courses is one that we'll talk about on another slide, but looking at how we can embed these constructs in multiple courses versus a standalone of here's the diversity course that you take in your program and you see it never again. Here's the social justice course that you take and you don't talk about it again. It relates to finances or relates to the legal aspects. And so thinking about how we can embed and integrate into multiple courses to some extent. Also thinking about on-demand models was something else that students reported, and making it accessible as a standalone possible Canvas course where we have a database of resources. And that's something we've already been talking about, possibly developing over the summer with videos and those types of things that would be a resource. Fireside chats, small group workshops, community spaces, survey collections, and then resource depository with some of the things in terms of approaches that we can take. From the faculty, we see a lot of similarities in terms of some of the same methods. Survey collection is where sharing ideas and examples would be something else. And so that's more of speaking to how as faculty do we collaborate with each other of, hey, I've had this particular article, or I've used this particular resource, or this particular model on Canvas, or whatever it is, to where we also share in that collegial kind of PLC, professional learning, and networking with each other as being another thing. What issues have you or do you anticipate facing related to critical or social justice theories? I think through these lenses, our students are definitely kind of in a different setting in terms of some of the things that they're facing. We also know that this cross between multiple types of programs. And so one of the first things at the top was impact on dissertation frameworks. And we talked a little bit about that in the fall in terms of potentially candidates that are writing their dissertation wanting to possibly use a critical theory, but having some anxiety about will it be accepted, and or how receptive will districts or institutions be to using a critical framework. Leaders and teachers being equipped to respond to the needs of diverse student populations. I've definitely seen that in some of my courses in terms of teachers feeling as if they are potentially not equipped to handle some of the topics that are coming up, and how they want to have more information so that when they are becoming a school principal or they're going back to their teams, they're equipped to handle some of those challenging topics. Political and parental backlash, something else we've kind of talked about today in terms of these, empowerment of parents to be the reporters of issues that they may have with specific curriculum, microaggressions, and so transversing some of those things that may come up related to race, social justice, and then sometimes having to either take those and or knowing how to respond to it. And so how do I respond to that situation that makes me feel a little bit uneasy? Funding for research projects, and then finally impact on media collections in school libraries was something else. We have several candidates in EDA that also are media specialists and have been kind of going through that process of parents requesting that certain books be taken from the shelves. And so they reported of that being a challenge in terms of how do we navigate that. If we have a policy in our district that says, here's the procedure for requesting a book to be reviewed, versus a parent that says, I want it off the shelf today, and the principal or district administrator saying, yes, take the bluest eye off your shelf because it has a reference to racism and I don't want it in the library. And so how do I, as a administrator, as a teacher leader, deal with that situation?
Chris, can you unpack the point of funding for research projects? What's the concern there?
Off the top of my head, I'm assuming it may be related to the frameworks.
Okay.
And so thinking about, will I be funded if I include this framework in my study or my proposal, I think is where that comes from. And so just having some anxiety about that piece.
And I think one more thing was that if I would be allowed to work in schools.
Mhm.
So if I'm not allowed to work in schools, then I end up looking at a similar issue elsewhere. Would my research be fundable? because it's more attractive if you, for sight recording agencies to do what we do.
In terms of faculty things, it was reported by a few faculty responses that students have been open and engaged and interested in discussions. So that kind of lends itself to the effectiveness of the instructional strategies being there around some of the topics. K through 12 educators fear for job security. And so if you are that one teacher on the staff that has been promoting these cultural texts and or promoting equity, diversity on your campus, are you then a target for being let go on your respective campus? The ability to teach social justice given current legislative climate, and so also thinking about this post tenure, those types of things, will I be that restricted as a faculty member from doing the things that I've normally done in terms of my classrooms? We snapshotted some of the courses that we have, and so we also had faculty and students report some of the course titles that they had taken that encapsulated social justice frameworks or content. And so on the left, we have a list of some of the required courses that were listed or reported from the respondents, and then elected courses. We tried to fill in where we thought some of the course titles filled. We also know that when students are reporting, sometimes they don't get the exact same course title. And so just in terms of where some of these courses fall, I think this also lends itself to some of the topics that may lend itself more to the content, i.e. diversity in higher education. You're expected to see it there. Leadership for diversity, you're expecting to see it there. And so thinking about how do we also embed these concepts into other courses that may not specifically speak to, but definitely transverse some of those topics that can be beneficial for students that are coming through the program or through the various programs. So I think our final kind of overarching discussion is what can we do as ELPS to respond to the state of Florida policies and legislation? As kind of that takeaway, I will say that this is in kind of through our discussion, it's not going to be a one-time stop. You know, it's something that will take time and energy, as well as something that has to be more than just lip service. And so writing it on paper that we're doing versus actively doing it, some of the things that emerged from the respondents in terms of recommendations, and we cannot do them all, but some of the things that emerged from students, educating legislators about critical theories. And so part of that lends itself to how do we unpack and make sure that we're not being led by a term and being heightened by a term and thinking about what does that actual legislation say, and how do we work as a collective body to educate those that are making those decisions about what some of these items mean. Continue to train educators to help eliminate bias, stereotypes, and hurtful practices. Definitely one that I think is doable as a collective whole. And so how do we prepare that next generation to face some of these situations? And part of that requires us to have those courageous conversations versus avoiding them. Network with other departments to mobilize efforts, power, and numbers. And again, this is from students. And so thinking through the lens of we're one department in the whole College of Education. College of Education is one college in the university scheme. And so how do we begin to network and look at what other departments are doing and how we may support each other in some of the work? Legislative updates in communications and announcements. And so that was requested and or put in terms of feedback of how do we provide students with ongoing information about what is happening in legislation and how it impacts education. Tenure track faculty taking the lead. And so I think this kind of lends itself to that discussion of individuals who may be non-tenured and or who are on that tenure track who are not there, and the voice that they want to definitely try to protect, but also the role that our tenure track faculty can play in that they have a little bit of more kind of grounding in terms of having tenure. Publications, research, and data from the department to influence lawmakers. And so producing content, producing information that can be used as references. And then finally, public statements and letters, resources to students who can advocate. And so I think this spoke to providing samples of items that students and or the public could potentially use to advocate for specific things that we may be targeting. From faculty, ongoing dialogue between students, faculty, and staff. And so kind of continuing that discussion to where it's not a one-time shot, but something that allows us to engage in those courageous conversations and conversations to improve as a whole. Departmental responses of a collective spirit versus a few faculty of color to develop the responses. And so this lends itself to kind of thinking about this is not just a Black only, a Hispanic only, a LGBTQ only, it's all of us collective. And so how do we work as a collective whole to provide responses and resources and do the work in terms of pushing the agenda forward. Encourage contact with legislative bodies and provide legislative updates. similar to what students kind of reported. Sound and consistent coursework and opportunities to students and faculty. And so thinking about that threaded content that may be embedded throughout multiple courses, as well as what are those PD items and resources that we provide to faculty, and then collaborate with other departments within the college. And so thinking through that lens of how does the college as a whole work together to collaborate on some of these issues.
What questions do you have?
Questions, clarification space.
What are you sitting
It's a
with?
lot of data. But again, a small sample size as well. But any clarification pieces on survey
I
response?
guess I have a bigger question in terms of how does this fit? This is relatively focused on critical theory, right? And so in the legislation and the setting, how does this fit within our overall kind of departmental diversity, equity, and inclusion vision, plan? So coming out of the work that we did, I think that we did 2 years ago now, maybe a little bit more, I don't know. And so how does this piece fit within that?
Well, we haven't had those conversations, and we want to pull Dr. Bertrand Jones in as well. But for us, I think it lends actionable items that contribute to some of that work that we did, not only as a department, but specifically as faculty, and some of our own professional development or opportunities for engagement. But I think it offers actionable items to not only think about our own departmental work, but our work beyond research, teaching, and community engagement. I think with the recommendations from students and faculty, there's actionable items that I think are linked to that previous work that we started.
Yeah, and I think your response was kind of spurred the idea that it's also that maybe the previous work was centered within our department and the student and faculty experience there. But this is something that shapes our experience from outside.
And definitely. I was gonna say expanding even, I mean, last year I know we did the land acknowledgement was one of those pieces that came about. And so I think as we're doing the work, there's constantly more that we can continue to add to that repertoire of things that we're doing to make sure it doesn't get lost from year to year. Okay, we did this one thing this one time and now we're good. We have all the competencies and skills that we need. No, there's always something, particularly in terms of legislation that's coming up. And so I think it allows us to be proactive in terms of making sure that we keep it on the radar, because it's a big piece. I think, sometimes we can get into, as Dr. Beatty kind of spoke about it, we get lulled into that space of, either fatigue and or it's over and done with, and there's constantly something that's kind of coming up. And I think the landscape is changing week after week, day after day, particularly with education. And so I think it provides us a space for some action items to ensure that we are providing and preparing that next generation of leaders and students to be equipped to handle some of these critical items that are going to be coming up.
I think part of that action item is also this language, right, that we're developing to talk about these issues and the way we are framing them. So one of the things that students said when we did that, I don't know if it was 2019 or 20, when this focus group with students, where they said that we don't know, like we feel this way, but we don't know how to engage in a conversation with the faculty about this. And sometimes we feel uncomfortable, but we just don't know. And we feel that there is this invisibility around these issues that are important to us. And I think probably having that language, having that discourse and this ongoing conversation framework helps people to imagine their challenges as part of something that we value as a community. So there can be more conversations outside of this room, hopefully among faculty, among students and students and staff, of course. So hopefully this would lead to things that we have envisioned, but hopefully more.
Yeah, I think this is really important time for us to kind of, I guess building on the prior work that leadership and I mean, in the past it was difficult because of COVID, we were just communicating virtually, but now we are back. And I think this is a really, important time now that we are done with, all the searches and then we welcome new faculty member. We can create this space that we can openly and talk about our concerns and what we see. Because, I guess the struggle that we have had, I guess, in this universities and the context that we study and do research and work within, is that this is not necessarily a inclusive place. And I think many students and faculty have experienced it. So for so many years, but we haven't had a space to talk about it. And I think that we have to change the culture in this institution, that first come to understanding of what's the reality here and what can we do about it. And I think that we do need to have this continuous conversation around the issues and build the awareness, I guess, among all of us, because this is not something that only a certain group of faculty or students should engage in. This is what we are, as a democratic, societal members and as a departments, as we have to create that space of equity and inclusion.
I think, in terms of actionable items, like where do we as individuals begin to act upon these words? So not only creating the space, but if you're going to have an item, then you need to also look at how do you enact these words? Where do we go beyond land acknowledgement? How do we show with our actions? And I think, the more we're exposed to it, the more we as individuals can take ownership of these actions. So how do you put them into your course outlines? How do you have projects, within a, 5-year strategic plan? How do you enact these, if you're looking at equity, if you're looking at justice, if you're looking at diversity and inclusion, how do those become items for student organizations to act on, for individual professors to act on? How can students take ownership of what we are learning in the classrooms, and how do professors show what they're doing, one step at a time? Like, how do we move from where we just talk to where it becomes something that is acted upon every single time? It's not only about creating that space for talking, but creating space for something to happen.
I have 2 different questions, so I'll start with the first one. So under student things, where it says educating legislators about critical theories, I guess I'm still trying to wrap my head around like how students can go about, or I'm a student myself, how we could go about doing that, but actually bringing like change. Like, well, right now, currently, I'm not really, discussing things with any legislators, but making it like a meaningful conversation, so I don't walk away thinking that I'm just, just talking in front of hot air and it's going in one ear out of the other. You kind of follow what I'm trying to do?
Yeah, and just for clarification, that was a student recommendation of us as a department.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I don't think they were saying the students. But that was the recommendation from the students.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, and then.
And probably that speaks to this also in terms of publications, research, and data that influence lawmakers, and so connecting those 2 together.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And then the other, there was a slide, let's start along before you started talking about the data, but on the one side it said, the Don't Say Gay bill, and then at the top it said something about like kindergarten to like 3rd grade, but it didn't necessarily say, I'm like, well, then what happens after 4th grade? And then just wrapping my head around it, because from that point of view, from the K-12, I'm like, okay, so it's definitely an attack on the LGBT community. And so other than folks who have, like taught in their home, like, if you are gay, we love you no matter what. Okay, so everybody doesn't have that. So then once they leave the K-12, like, is there a disconnect in high school? Then once they get to us, we just do all the training. Like, I'm lost. I'm just trying to figure that out.
So just one, so the bill says that kindergarten to grade 3, there should be no discussion of gender identity. So
Okay.
it's completely out. After that, it's like, it should be age and developmentally appropriate. And of
That's
course,
it, Dr. Small.
yeah, so, that's like open to interpretation, right? What is age and developmentally appropriate? And again, when you leave things kind of, okay, this is not a good thing to talk about, but you can possibly talk about it if it's developmentally or age appropriate. I think many people would choose not to talk about it because you don't want to get sued, you don't want to get into that whole thing. And so it is censorship, but kind of censorship in a way that is more passive aggressive than aggressive aggressive. So I think, and you just to clarify that was.
So I'm glad you said that too, Dr. Khurshid. I'm sorry, I just got one more thing. So when you said that, and Dr. Beatty mentioned too, like it's giving parents ownership, like they have a space in their child's education. And it's like, well, I'm just thinking like, well, then what happens on the back end if somebody cries wolf? My kid came home and said they talked about this when the teacher like really made it a point not to, you know, make a mistake or talk about it or make sure it wasn't part of the curriculum. Then it's like, I'm like, well, then what happens then if they cry wolf like and somebody's going to court just out of a hypothetical or?
Well, this is my opinion.
Yeah.
These bills are being put into place so they can go to court. The goal is for the bill to be able to be upheld in court so that it can be maintained as law. So then we can go to 4th, 5th, 6th grade, then we can go to middle school, then we can go to high school. Like there's legislation coming down the pipe. So the goal really is for the bills to be able to be held up in a court of law. So then they can go and can continue to enact other laws that might be a little bit more restrictive, a little more explicit in what it's trying to do. So the goal really is for somebody to be the individual that brings the bill to sue. So then we can see if it can be upheld and which courts is it going to be upheld? Does it get to the Supreme Court, right? Like that is in some ways the goals of a lot of this legislation.
It also incites fear as well. I would think, part of that also is, hey, if I have a fear that I'm going to be reported, I'm going to completely avoid and or not touch certain topics. And so it by nature extracts information from those kind of conversations. Right now, teachers they're not tenured. And so if I'm not a tenured teacher and I have the possibility of this being something that may come back to be a mark on my record, I'm not going to take that. And so it also incites that fear of even going down that pipeline to discuss or have something come back.
And we know this, but it's the detriment of the child, right? So if I don't go to my 2nd grade teacher and I'm like, I like that little boy over there, and they like, don't talk to me about that, right? And that puts it like, well, right? So
It's like a fear tactic.
Or how about the teachers that have, or students whose parents are homosexual?
Right.
Like, we're not going to talk about those families, like they don't exist.
So we have an online question that I'm not sure that I can do justice reading off the screen. If you want to maybe pull up the chat, that might be better. You'll see what I mean. It's a great question, but I don't know if I should read it or not.
You've been incited with fear. So this one, let's see.
It is that, it's from
Sean. To what extent do you see these classes of policy strategies as curtailing with a larger drive to externalize mechanisms of inducement and deterrence as a with the choice?
He did provide an update, maybe a more paraphrased question below.
I think it's actually a great question, because it is about that when we are talking about choice is seen as being central to democratic system and our freedom. But in this case, the rhetoric of choice is actually being used to curtail those choices and equity, and it's actually subverting some of the systems that are supporting equity initiatives. So in a way, this whole capitalist system of free choice and also equity, how they themselves do not always complement each other. They can be contradictory values, and that's something that you see in these bills. that is kind of.
The other framing of this choice is it in some ways diminishes or dismisses the expertise of educators,
Yeah.
right? And us understanding developmental readiness and other things when I know what's right for my child is my child, right? Like I have the choice to do what's right for my child, whereas that's might be like the teacher might understand of how to have a conversation with a 2nd-year-old around gender identity, but I don't want my child to have that conversation. It's diminishing the expertise of the educator to understand developmental readiness, right?
And also the whole debate about the role of the state, right? It's like, okay, should school be an extension of home, right? If it is, then it is certain homes that it is reflecting and not other homes. So then what happens when it is not extension of home, when the child is exposed to, other ways of thinking? So then all of a sudden, that's not a choice. That's, so what is the role of the state? Who should determine what is being taught versus individuals? So I think that does go into.
I was just gonna say, I think you all did an excellent job of sort of connecting all these bills together as sort of this larger ideological project, right? That is sort of hostile, in my opinion, to sort of public education and multiracial democracy. But I think the common through line here to answer that question is, right, one of the common through lines is obviously this sort of tearing away at or pulling apart this idea of public education and further centering it on this notion of individual, like consumptive choice. And that certain individuals have more consumptive choice or power within that market to make and dictate choices. And the mechanism to do that is through legal action, right? And I think that that's clear in all the, whether it's the viewpoint diversity bill, whether it's the divisive concepts bill, whether it's the Don't Say Gay bill, right? That deputizing individual citizens and their ways to express that consumptive choice through legal action. And again, who is empowered in that situation is who's in power in many of these situations, right? So I think that whatever the bill is, there's this common project throughout all of them that is sort of stripping away sort of the expertise of public educators, public leaders, but also empowering individuals to do that through sort of formal mechanisms, through statute, right?
Exactly, and interestingly, that individual rights somehow become more convoluted when we go to the bill about abortion. Yes. So it's just interesting how then it becomes the individual rights of the fetus of the child and not woman.
And the legal system, which critical race theory is asking us to analyze is how this gets operationalized, right?
Yeah.
And to your point, Dr. Lynn.
Would you be willing to back up to the slide showing the list of classes offered in ELPS that offer these? One thing that I noticed here is that nearly all of these courses are focused on qualitative methodology, and I think that we have a very good underrepresentation of explicit instruction in quantitative methodology that is non-damaging to people who are not white. And I would really love to, I think that one action item that can emerge from these conversations is to also expand this discussion and bring it into how can we remove some of the historical damage that numbers have done to Black and brown communities and the way that they've been used to reinforce and reproduce this sort of oppressive narrative that existed in the past. And the last little thing I wanted to comment was that I listened on the radio the other night to a discussion about free speech, and the speaker talked about weaponized nostalgia. And I think that really is it really rang true when we were talking about the parental choice and the individual choice being more important than the collective exchange of free ideas, is this idea that somehow in the past, if we were to return to some non-existent golden age of free speech, that it would be that these issues would go away when we remember a past, when we remember a past, there's never been such a thing as that sort of free speech, but weaponized nostalgia came to mind, thinking of what it would be like in the past before we had to talk about these issues of us.
Just a comment reminded me Many of you may have heard this, the hearing for the Judge Jackson. When the senator asked her, what's her opinion on the teaching critical race theory in school? She's like, from my understanding, critical race theory is a framework in academia. I don't have any training on this. I have no plans in using that framework in my work, and I haven't come across it in my work. I don't plan on adopting it. I just find that very interesting when the whole conversation emerged from the bills and how it will work in the system.
So unpacking that entire.
I was like, well.
I think that just goes to show how the onus and the responsibility is always placed on that minoritized group to, to move ahead with what is being so difficult and an obstacle placed in front of them, because we always look at, teach me, we go to African American communities and the responsibility is placed on them to teach us about what happens, how to move forward with anti-racist narratives and so forth. And every time it's those groups, if we want to look at LGBTQ plus communities, we go to them to be able to teach the rest of us. And every time that responsibility is based on groups that already have so much to deal with. So Dr. Beatty, you talked about, we can see already what is coming in the pipeline. What does that mean for our college or department or professors? How do you see, we have taken special topics, critical race theory, we have done classes, and listened to Dr. TBG coming to do, special talks, you have instructed us, and Dr. Khurshid has that already in her course outlines around these qualitative courses. We do it in EDA. So what do you see happening down the road? And it doesn't seem to be that far down the road.
As far as our department or what's coming politically or legislatively?
I think you hinted at what is coming politically, what happens here within the college, within the department.
So we want to continue the conversation in the sense of more directed, focused conversation with the focus groups, in the sense of targeting areas of curriculum, targeting areas of culture, community building, targeting areas of education, like what education do we need collectively. The survey was enlightening to us, right? When thinking about, I think we make assumptions, I think Dr. Khurshid and Dr. Small made this point. We make assumptions that we're quote unquote liberal or progressive in education. Not saying that everybody needs to be, but sometimes that's the assumption, when I think we need to have a collective conversation of who's uncomfortable with this conversation, right? Who's in our community that's uncomfortable with this conversation? And do they feel marginalized? And why do they feel marginalized? And what ways do they feel marginalized? And then thinking about, are we collectively being able to articulate why some of these bills might be problematic? Because some people might be like, I see no problem with that bill, right? And they're silenced in a way, but I want them to say why they might be okay with the bill, in the sense of them being a part of our learning community, because they're going into schools, or they're going to be on college campuses, or they're going to be in policy houses, and they're going to be informing these things. So do we have a collective language? Do we have a collective values? And then how are they being enacted, whether that be through curriculum, through community engagement? So we want to be focused with the focus groups, to think about how we inform each other about how we move forward in the community that we want to be, in order so we can have not only individual action, but collective action as a department. We didn't talk about that fully, so that was my answer. I want to speak for my two colleagues.
No, you do.
Thank you. I feel like as a researcher community, the broader communities, when we look at all those major conferences, the focus right now is always equity and social. And so we have a lot we can learn because we are not the only one who is doing this conversation. We start to really question that this institutional racism that has existed and inequality having been reproduced over generation after generation. And so I think I would encourage each of us, like students, faculty, to learn from those broader community when we go to conferences and then hear what other department, what other universities, those faculties and students are doing. Because I think as we can, I think it's the time we can come together to kind of learn.
And being intentional about bringing that information back. Like I went to a conference session, Dr. Moker, Dr. Clark, I really want to talk about this. What does that look like for us to engage in this? Like being intentional about what we're learning and bringing that back to a space that we can make action on, right?
One thing that's, I think, on my radar also is that from what I've seen, particularly with K-12 teachers, they are struggling right now to meet the learning needs of students post-pandemic. And so part of that lies in, there were already deficiencies from generational things. They're already coming in ill-prepared for certain things, particularly with reading. And so now you've compounded that with this pandemic where because of my financial situation, because of my background, because of whatever it is, I was further pushed back down the pipeline to where now I'm still trying to play catch up. I didn't have internet access for a year. And so I'm still in 3rd grade. My counterparts are already in 4th grade, or I'm in 9th grade. My counterparts are already in 11th grade. And so you're seeing this widening of the trenches and teachers not being prepared to address those gaps even more so. And then you compound that with social justice tension and crisis that occurs that causes trauma. And you have students who say, I'm done. And so now I'm dropping out of school because there was no one there on the other side to make sure that I did not fall into that generational trap again. And so now I have increased crime rates. And so now I have increased unemployment rates. And so we then see all of these pieces start to connect and the cycle starts all over again. And so we really have an opportunity right now to utilize this information and keep this dialogue going to prepare ourselves for preparing that next generation of leaders and teachers and higher ed faculty that are coming on to make sure that they are able to address those things like now. Like we cannot wait until next year to say, oh yeah, let's go back and have this conversation about why we should have diverse perspectives in the classroom. And so I think this really gives us a unique space to do some great work, but it's going to take a collective effort. And so I think that also speaks to just the response rates in terms of we have to have the information and being open to having some of those difficult conversations. And when it's stressful and it's tension, how do I rely on colleagues and peers to kind of keep us going in the right direction because you can't do it by yourself. And that fatigue that sets in terms of having some of those conversations can be a lot, and knowing when to turn it off and say, okay, I've seen enough of this today, but let me try again next week. Let me try again tomorrow to kind of keep pushing forward to ensure that you're engaging in that effort because we have a lot of lives at stake from all different backgrounds that are depending on us to do the work to ensure that they don't end up being another statistic. So keep working.
Okay, so I think we're about at time for today, but I would like to take a moment to thank our presenters, not only for a very engaging presentation, but also for their leadership on this issue and for all the service they've done over the past year and collecting feedback on behalf of their department. So please join me in a round of applause. Thank all of you for participating not only today, but throughout our R3 this year, and look forward to joining again in the fall where we'll be doing a spotlight on our new faculty.